All right, buddy. Great conversation we just had with Doctors Lucy Hone and Denise Quinlan. Lucy and Denise run the New Zealand Institute for Wellbeing and Resilience, and they're a couple of just really incredible, not just academics, but practitioners in this space. Lucy has an excellent book, Resilient Grieving, How to Find Your Way Through a Devastating Loss. She has a TED Talk along similar lines called The 3 Secrets of Resilient People, which was among the top 20 TED Talks in 2020. Denise runs a really wonderful podcast by the name of Bringing Wellbeing to Life. We'll share that in the show notes. She's an experienced practitioner. She's given talks and workshops all over the world. So they're both really powerhouses individually, but they've collaborated in such a wonderful way through this institute and have their hands in all sorts of things. And we talked about all sorts of topics. What were some of the highlights for you, John?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So I loved their distinction between individual and collective resilience. And they argue that you have to have collective resilience to be resilient at all. So these two are codependent on each other, inextricably linked. And they said some really interesting things about post-traumatic growth and how that requires more than just having had a traumatic experience. It also requires a struggle after the traumatic experience to recover. And they define this as where your worldview is shattered, or you've lost a kind of a strong sense of meaning in your life. You have to rebuild your life afterwards. And that's how post-traumatic growth is possible. How about you?
That part, that was super powerful. I mean, anyone listening should go check out Lucy's TED Talk, but just diving into some of the nuances between fragility, resilience, anti-fragility, collective resilience, and just this general question of like, how do you flourish and keep feeling pretty good when stuff sucks? I mean, it's the simple way to say it, right? At minimum, let alone if you're experiencing trauma. So I was just really happy we got into this topic overall. It's long overdue.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So awesome. Well, without further ado, here is our conversation with Doctors Denise Quinlan and Lucy Hone. Hope you enjoy. Will you both each individually tell us, and maybe you have the same definition, you work so closely together, how do you think of flourishing?
So I did my PhD on flourishing and well-being definitions and looking at all those different theoretical models, because it seemed to me that if we wanted to actually promote and protect human flourishing, then we better understand what it is. And so I looked at all of those different models, and the definition that we use is feeling good and functioning well, which is basically the kind of most standard definition. And we like it, of course, because it's theoretically sound. But in our work, we're communicating in a way that people can actually resonate with. It's also really good and important, and from that perspective, because it just makes sense to people. Feeling good, okay, so it's about being happy, but functioning well, okay, it's about more than just being happy. So then in terms of resilience, where does that come in? So we do adopt Karen Reivich's definition of resilience, which is that to steer through adversity and learn from it. But actually in Denise and my hands, we actually sort of take it a step further into layman's terms, that resilience is about all the things that you do to enable you either to get back to flourishing or flourish while the tough stuff is going on. So, the goal is basically feeling good and functioning well, but resilience is how you either maintain that despite whatever is going on in your life, or you gradually over time get back to feeling good and functioning well, which if you have really adverse conditions and potentially traumatic events, obviously takes time. So it's a bit simplistic to think that we're all aiming to flourish all the time.
That time piece has been really important. Recently, I've been mentioning that a lot with people, that, if resilience is about being able to withstand, cope with, and recover over time from adversity and challenge. And I'm pointing out to people that, one, that doesn't mean being immune.
Right.
We are brought to there are things that will bring us to our knees. And sometimes it will take a long time to recover. And grief is a really good example, Lucy, of, bereavement is something that really affects us for a long time. And saying to people that, it's not about being immune. And it's not about bouncing back. Sometimes it's about crawling forward till you can stand again,
So that makes total sense. Karen's a friend of mine. I recommend books all the time. No book do I recommend more than The Resilience Factor. But in fairness, Lucy, maybe I need to dig into yours as well. So I love to keep digging into that topic. And I want to ask a follow-up question, because I've been doing a lot of work around this concept of anti-fragility, which we sort of extend, right? I'm going to say beyond resilience, not in that it's better or worse, but rather than bouncing back, say, to baseline, is there actually some observable sort of growth experienced from that trauma, from that adversity, from that unpleasantness? Either of both of you done some work in this area? Does that concept resonate with you?
Yeah, we haven't done empirical research in it. We do in our training, so we're now running a short cohort-based course called A Better Way to Grieve, which is basically getting people to understand that there are better ways than the 5 stages of grief, and that they need to find their better way, personalize it. And in that, we use Zoom polls, so we're starting to gather that data. And certainly, people, you do see growth, and we've just recently asked them what they want more training on, and grief and growth is the number one topic that they wanted to hear more about. But having said that, we are so careful, aren't we, Denise, and sensitive to the fact that it's bloody annoying to be told you have to grow out of your trauma.
I bet.
And the other piece that is interesting is, the work on post-traumatic growth is really clear on, if you like, the definitions of that. The post-traumatic growth is growth that comes after an event or adversity that smashes your worldview, and you have to put it together again. So I think we have to be really careful about putting labels of post-traumatic growth on, failing an exam. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think, pulling back, when we think about the anti-fragility, as human beings, we're always learning from our experiences. And so there should always be ongoing moving forward and growth. And I think another piece that kind of feeds into the anti-fragility is collective resilience. I know do you want me to mention that?
Well, we do want to talk about that. Yes, absolutely. Can I just go into something you've just said about post-traumatic growth?
We're going to nerd out with you, but we will come back to collective resilience. We're going to get into the weeds with you. Yeah, sorry, John.
Definitely want to talk about collective resilience, but I just want to ask what you just said about post-traumatic growth. That's really interesting. That, for example, a student failing an exam maybe can't experience post-traumatic growth, but can't they experience trauma from that kind of experience?
Well, so, actually, in terms of post-traumatic growth, the trauma is subjective. That's fact. It is, if it's traumatic enough for you, then yes, you can grow from it. But as Denise so carefully said, it is not the trauma that gives you the growth. It is the struggle that comes from that trauma. So if the struggle is sufficient to smash apart all of your existing core beliefs about how the world should work, then there is potential for post-traumatic growth. You'd hope that failing one exam would not be sufficient to literally dismantle your core beliefs about what is meant to happen in the world, how people are meant to act, what your life might look like going forward. So I think that is really important.
Like having your PhD rejected and downgraded to a master's, that's a kind of an exam event that could smash a worldview, an identity, and a moving forward. But short of that, are we talking about changing identities. I think one of the things that comes in here that we have to be really careful about is the labeling we use. You know, if everything is trauma, I don't like that for people. You know, one of the things we talk about in our work is struggle is part of life. This is normal. Adversity, rainy days, failing exams are a normal part of life. And I'm really kind of wary of us labeling that trauma. I'm much more keen to go, this is part of life. You are not alone.
Okay, so can we go with that for a second? Because you probably saw John smile. I can't think of an episode, we've done about 20 so far. I can't think of an episode where the utility of unpleasantness, right, and its impact on well-being in the research hasn't come up. It comes up almost every single time, right? So my question for you is, okay, trauma is, at least on some level, subjectively experienced. Makes some sense because we experience well-being, at least by some measures, subjectively as well. It's kind of like how far you're bouncing away from the baseline, more or less, right? Yeah. What's the difference, or how do you find the point of distinction between utilitarian unpleasantness and actual trauma? And I hesitate to even say actual, right? But I think you understand my question.
So this is not our area of expertise, firstly, but what I would say is that definition that post-traumatic growth comes out of the struggle, a struggle that is sufficient to absolutely decimate your core beliefs. Okay. Now, I think that's easy to understand. Yeah. Okay. I'll give you an example that for us, when we, you all here know that we lost our daughter in a tragic car accident, and her best friend and a really good friend of mine in 2014. So obviously that is the moment that your entire life, as you thought you were going to live it and you thought you knew it, was just smashed apart. So for me, I remember Marty talking to me about post-traumatic growth, and I remember reading about it and seeing the definition as that your life is better off than before. And I was like, whoa, no thanks, everyone. I will not accept that my life is better off without Abby. But can I see growth along those 5 dimensions? Yeah, absolutely, I can. That I accept. But what was interesting for me is that when we went through the COVID pandemic, particularly the beginning lockdowns and then the really severe lockdowns, is that I realized very quickly that the trauma that we had gone through, both in the earthquakes where I live and then losing Abby, had meant that I had completely readjusted my life expectations, and I'd readjusted my daily life practices, and I really had rebuilt and reconfigured my core beliefs in response to those traumatic events. So that when COVID came along, I looked around and went, everyone was talking about what they would change now they'd had this experience. And I was like, oh no, we've done all that. We did all that change before. So it was substantial enough that the events created long-lasting change in our behaviors and how we experience the world. So does that make sense? I think there is a really difference there.
It's very helpful.
And if you think about, say, other trauma like abuse by a teacher or a parent, that smashes your trust in a relationship and a place that should be safe. So I think there is something about this smashing your worldview, your beliefs in the way the world works, your beliefs in what you can rely on. And the Christchurch,
it's got to be sufficient to really break that down, all of your assumptions and your deeply held core beliefs. And what you do in the process is then rebuild them over time, which is...
I don't want to take this too far because you both just humbly acknowledge this is not your area of expertise. You're sending off all sorts of interesting thoughts in my head. What was it, 2 weeks ago, John? We talked to Lisa Miller. Do either of you know Lisa? Lisa's a spiritual psychology. Yeah, she's a spiritual child, the awakened brain, big famous TED Talk. Anyway, so we're talking about spirituality and flourishing. And so the thought just came to my head. I don't expect anyone to have an answer, but I want to put it out there. If you have a strong enough sense of meaning and spiritual belief that your quote unquote worldview cannot be shifted. And I don't know that anyone has that. Okay. All right. Go, Denise, go. I saw your face.
So one of the things that happens often in traumatic bereavement, or not even necessarily traumatic, is I cannot believe in a God that would do this to my child.
Right.
You know, where
right.
people have experienced long suffering. So for some people, their faith is strengthened. When we sat with the Muslim community in the mosque in Christchurch after the shooting, it was their faith that was the thread that was pulling them through.
Yep.
But I have seen other people turn away from the church after a loss, a traumatic loss.
Essentially coming back from loss is the number one process that you are doing is meaning making. You are consolidating this terrible loss, whether it is a divorce or dementia or a death or, all sorts of loss. You are rebuilding your life schema around the fact that that event was possible and that it has happened. So it takes time.
So this clears up very nicely something I wanted to ask you, because I was thinking of post-traumatic growth experiences such as, where some of the primary research was done on post-traumatic stress disorder, Army veterans, for example, military personnel, where they'd just seen a shocking experience, like their friend get killed. I was thinking in those kind of contexts, you might not have your worldview shattered. Like maybe none of your beliefs have been shattered. You knew this happened, but all of a sudden you've watched your close friend get killed. So it's more that it's just such a deep, unpleasant experience that it requires a hell of a lot of getting over. But the way you've described it there, Lucy, I can now see how it would connect with those kind of experiences too, that you'd have to rebuild your life around it in that certain things.
Tom Attig describes our life as having like a spider web of connections. And when somebody is taken from it, there's a hole in the web. And we have to rebuild around it. Right. And it affects not just like in a family situation or in a friend situation, it affects not just you, but the other people who are grieving too. They may all grieve differently. And so all of those relationships change, And
I was just going to add quickly here before we leave this topic, which is this all leads to why my resilient grieving model is a load of jigsaw pieces. So in our hands, the grief process basically comes from the fact that your world has been smashed apart as you know it, and what you've lost pieces, you've lost a key part of your jigsaw piece. You no longer recognize your life, but over time, what you are doing during your bereavement, as you are relearning to live in the world, is putting your life story back into a coherent form. And in our hands, we always say to people, you have to find what makes sense to you and what works for you to do that. And every kind of aha moment, every little piece that you pick up you find out about oscillation theory, or you hear about continuing bonds, or you work out a ritual of some way or some legacy moment, something that you can really hold on to that makes that process a bit easier. Those are your pieces of the jigsaw that you put together over time, and eventually you are rebuilding this coherent picture. So it's a process of sense making.
So does collective resilience, to come back to that, because I'm making lots of natural connections, but I want to make sure I understand it. Are you talking about, resilience through collective behavior, meaning an individual, you go through your trauma, Lucy, right? And you friends, family, community, you mentioned, right, the shooting in the mosque and those sorts of things. Is it a matter of we are more resilient? I mean, it's rhetorical, I know the answer, but we're more resilient when we have those positive connections? Or are you talking about collective resiliency as in an entire community's resiliency?
Look, it could operate at different levels, but if we unhook this from trauma, okay, and we just think about the last couple of years and which communities and organizations coped well through the pandemic, which organizations have not had staff fleeing from them. They tend to be places where the quality of the relationships, the level of support, how much people value being known to each other, that it's all that stuff. And so one of the things that we say is resilience grows between us as well as within you. And if we think about individual resilience as learning to swim, collective resilience is about the health of the pool. And from 2020 on, we had so many requests globally. Like last year, Lucy reckons we worked with over 30,000 people, but we had massive requests for, oh my God, can you tell us how to be resilient and tell us how to make our staff resilient? But if you are just telling people to develop their personal resilience strategies without attending to the pool they're in, it's the 2022 equivalent of saying, take a concrete pill and harden up.
Yeah.
Because if you're asking people to just put it all on their shoulders, be more resilient, but we're not paying any attention to the way people are able to interact. If we're doing shifts where there's no handover, if we're never making time for teams to get together, and we're not actually looking after the pool, we're making it really hard for people to swim.
And this comes down to the individual level too, because, as Denise and I, as you like to say, Denise, in our training at the moment, we've got a slide that says, what has helped you get through in the last year. And of course, when everyone has those conversations, it's not what, but it's who. They always come back and talk about people. And we do this, there's 13 of us at the Institute, we do this for each other. One of us is looking, as Denise would say, a bit crispy around the edges. Oh my God. Getting close to burnout. And it's always, one of us will be like, hey, colleague.
And I wasn't just I used to say a bit crispy around the edges. And then recently I was like, I'm setting off smoke alarms. I am taking a week off. And when I said that, Lucy said, yeah, good. You're not good to be around at the moment. But I mean, reality is that is collective resilience, is, me saying to Denise, you go and take a week off. Tell me, what do you want to do? Like, if you want to do anything, because she wasn't actually taking a week's holiday, but she was just going to get away from emails and going to get away from the kind of the admin of the business. And so I said to her, go and choose the bits that you want to do and go and have some creative, thinking time, and tell me what needs to be done so that I can pick it up. And I've definitely had moments in the last few years after Abby dying when I'd be about to go and stand on a stage somewhere, and I'd either say to Denise or someone else, one of our other colleagues, actually, I can't do this on my own today. I just don't have that inner strength. You're coming with me. Just either come and do a Q&A with me or come and stand right next to me. But I literally need your physical support and strength right now to face this. That's collective resilience.
I want to give John a chance to bridge, kind of a concept or a series of studies and some research from the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard. But I'll just quickly mention, we talked earlier about anti-fragility, and my partner and I, the person I'm working with, we always talk about really anything in this space. Top down, so starts in the head. Bottom up, starts in the body. What you're talking about is outside in, which is the third part, right? The surrounding environment has to play a role in this. Right?
And one of the things we say is we are each other's environment. Right. We worry an awful lot about the air conditioning and the chairs and all the rest of it. But the person you are sitting next to has a much bigger impact on your day than a chair. And being aware of how we impact each other. And we often talk to people about, we're like weather systems. What kind of weather system are you bringing to work today? Are you mainly rain and a storm cloud? And being aware of that responsibility of how we impact each other. And looking at what are the kind of Jane Dutton has shared some beautiful work around the kind of work routines that help people build psychological safety. Yeah. Because fundamentally, when you build psychological safety, the outcome is collective resilience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said.
Okay, so I'd like to ask before we move on a connected question to the point Nick was just mentioning there about a way to connect this with some research and flourishing is: can you be resilient without possessing collective resilience? Do you have to have the latter
I would say no. Isaac Politensky has done a lot of work in this space. And Isaac Politensky says there is no individual well-being without collective well-being. And Isaac would take that bigger to go, how can you be well in a completely unjust and unfair society?
Right. So you can't have well-being then either individually unless the collective, the context in which you are in, people are well, or the environment is.
Well, I can look after my own well-being, but if I'm living with massive injustice all around me, and doesn't that have an impact?
Yeah, I was going to say, why would you? I mean, really, why would you want individual well-being? For one thing, it just doesn't make any sense to me. Because, and also, you're not getting meaning. Even if we look at well-being and we look at any of the models of well-being, if there's meaning and accomplishment and emotions and connections in there, then no, I would challenge that and say you can't have individual well-being as an island, because all of those meaning comes from serving something bigger than yourself, your social connections. I mean, we are social beings at heart, so no, not for me. But we come from a collectivist culture, though, now. So,
but Lucy, you also mentioned at the onset, you did your PhD on a lot of these different frameworks and models. And whenever I'm walking people through them, I basically say, listen, none of them are the same, but almost all of them have two things in common: relationships and meaning. Yeah. Right. The two things that we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. So important. Hey. And meaning is about serving something bigger than yourself. So, about not being individual.
John and I have had conversations about whether or not conversations we've had with guests around a historical figure who I think is objectively evil could have been flourishing, could have been well, right? And the direction we keep taking is no. What about character? What about virtue? What about altruism? What about positive impact? I think I hear you saying something similar.
We make strange accommodations, okay? From at the individual level, I've heard people, there's an old kind of saying of, a mother is only as happy as her happiest child. We care about the people in our relationships. Yeah. At a collective level, we either care or we cut off pieces of ourselves and put barriers up, We've got a podcast coming out on Thursday with Helen Robinson, the CEO of the Auckland City Mission. And in part one, we're talking about how do you work on a mission so profoundly where there is so much suffering without burning out. In the second part, we're talking about what's the impact of poverty on well-being and on the people experiencing poverty and on the bystanders. And and this is a bit I think is interesting. Like if we say, I can be flourishing in my own little bubble, but I have to maintain a bubble to pretend everything's okay. And as soon as I take that bubble down and I see massive suffering beyond me, what am I doing? I can either pretend it's not there or I can act. Does that make sense?
Of course. It's an interesting...
It's where we draw the lines.
Well, that's what I was going to say is when you said bubbles, I said, well, there's a lot of bubbles in play, right? And so like, if the bubble is like, does my family, or in this case, my wife have to be well for me to be well? I see a more direct connection than, for instance, if somebody halfway around the world isn't well, that I can't see the face, I can't feel the emotion, I can't be in their presence. But it makes sense on the surface. I'm just thinking, what are those different bubbles, right? And where the way you said it, where are those lines?
And it's like, it's lines, but it's also maybe mental gymnastics. And I think it would be really interesting to explore what's the cost, what's the allostatic load, the cognitive load of shutting out an awful lot of stuff to maintain your bubble.
Although we're pretty good at it because we have that confirmation bias, don't we? And, people are quite good at staying in their bubbles, as we know.
Okay. Do you think that counterbalances with what's the cost if you don't? Like the constant consumption of negative media, the constant consumption of negative news, is that just like we need to develop a thicker skin, anti-fragility, if you will, to like grow the capacity to keep taking that in and keep having an impact, right, on these other people, other communities?
Oh, look, there's two really different ways of thinking about this. One is kind of a more Buddhist approach, which is what Helen Robertson describes, of being able to stand in the suffering and not be destroyed by it, but be transformed by it and use it as fuel to propel yourself forward to work for this cause. And that's really coming from a place of compassion so that you can bear witness to it and not be destroyed by it. At a very everyday level, we have to draw our lines to go, what is possible? What can I do in my day? What will a good day be? Lucy, do you want to speak to that piece?
I think that is something we all need to take care of and be mindful of at an individual level, is what we can tolerate and where we are focusing our attention, and is that helping or harming us in our quest to, whether it is literally get out of bed in the morning or in our quest to, in Helen Robinson's case, to actually, do the good work that she's doing, or if you are an advocate and your resilience is more about resistance, how much bad news do you need to fuel that fire and how much is too much to immobilize you? And that comes down to the individual, and that is so important to have your self-awareness around that and then ways to self-regulate it.
Well said.
There's an interesting piece in here that ties in with Judy Moskowitz's work around positive emotion being an important way of coping with significant health and life stress. And her, she's worked with people with dementia, people with AIDS, and people who've been bereaved by AIDS, stage 4 breast, a whole range of things, okay? But the piece that we often share with people in the work we do is positive and negative emotion can both fuel your action towards goals. Negative emotion, moving away from the bad thing, is I think of it as the powerful fuel that can get the rocket off the ground. But if you're going to Mars, you need to let that go after takeoff. And your longer term fuel that is not going to eat away at your body is the positive emotion of what you're moving towards. And I think if you're trying to fuel a long-term goal on positive emotion, on negative emotion, like Black Lives Matter, like any social justice movement, to stay fueled by anger and sadness is hard on you. And a much more sustainable long-term approach is connecting to what's the benefit we're going to create for other people? What will it be like? What am I moving towards?
And actually, the same is true of grief and loss, that we know now. You probably, I don't know if you ever heard of oscillation theory, and that is that really the most healthy way to cope with your loss is to sometimes approach it and to actually, deal with the loss and the misery and the keening and the yearning and all of that. And then sometimes to have a break, to kind of ebb and flow, oscillate backwards and forwards. And that's where positive emotion comes in as well. That, it's okay to take breaks from grieving. You don't want to be avoiding it, but you absolutely can. That's, use positive emotions as a top up and a break in your restoration and recovery.
In our fourth episode, we had Anna Lemke on, and she wrote a wonderful book, Dopamine Nation. She basically said, the simple way to say it is well-being. Like a lot of good research on well-being suggests actually should be oscillating between, sure, plenty of pleasant emotion, but the occasional bit of unpleasant emotion as well.
Yeah. And just in our daily lives, I've just had a 6-week sprint, which is quite a long working sprint, where I, had to get something done, big project, got down to probably only sleeping about 4 hours a night, exercising hard throughout because I knew I needed to keep the show on the road. And I really couldn't sleep more than that because I just had so much to do, so much cortisol and adrenaline.
Yeah.
And it's taken me 10 days to come down from it. And now I'm exhausted. And I'm really fascinated to see, I'm enjoying that because I'm taking that as a good sign that I'm no longer absolutely hyped and working at, at that kind of 1 million miles an hour, and it's okay to be tired. I went back to bed. I did 3 hours work the other day and went back to bed at 11:30 in the morning and thought, I'm just going to have a snooze. This is a good thing.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
So look, you've got us. You started to give some description of where we can glean some practical strategies from as to how we can develop and build resilience individually and collectively. Can we go a bit further on that? So, what are most effective ways that you would both argue to build resilience individually and collectively? Although you both argue that they're inextricably linked.
Yeah, so I'd start with strong supportive connections, actually just connections. Let's think about those to start off with. So that is obviously people in your social network, but think broadly, and particularly in our loss work, something very practical we do is get people to realize they need different forms of support. So you need emotional support, you need practical support, you need knowledge support, you need instrumental, intellectual support, but you also need support of people just to remember your person, memory support. So that's a kind of example of how much you can kind of break it down. And then you need connections as in spirituality, your religion, serving something bigger than yourself, certainly a sense of mission. In the work we do, particularly where people come to us, they've either seen my TED Talk, read my book, but they come to us saying, we want more. We want, as Denise would call it, hope and a plan. We know we need the fuel of hope, but we actually want a sort of concrete plan as well. Yeah. They so often talk about mission. It's really fascinating, isn't it, to hear them say, I've got to survive this loss because I've got to keep my job, I've got to keep my family together, I really wanted that career, promotion, and I'm not prepared to let that go. I've already lost so much. So, Denise, what do you want to add to that?
Kind of at a granular level, when we think about what do people need to be able to do to be resilient? You cannot do any of this work unless you have self-awareness and self-regulation. So the ability to notice what's happening, the ability to take that noticer pause, to be able to make a choice about what you do and to be able to choose an action. That's the absolute kernel of this work for me, because if you can't do that, we're in billiard ball territory, we're just ricocheting around. So self-awareness, being able to take the notice or pause, and then being able to self-regulate, being able to choose. And that's where I love the question Lucy asks people all the time of, is what I'm doing helping or harming me? It's such a powerful question because it puts you back in the driver's seat of your life. It encourages self-awareness. It makes you pause and take stock and go, where should I take action? Yeah.
And it also encourages self-compassion, which is the third real foundation of resilience. Yeah. So I think,
and we know in resilience work, flexible and accurate thinking is important. If your thinking's pretty sound and you're able to evaluate each situation as it comes and goes, you are more resilient for that. But most of it's jump it, kind of fall into certain habitual patterns or thinking traps. And working with Karen for a long time, and we talk about flexible and accurate thinking. And I remember somebody asking her once, if you could only have one, which would you choose, flexibility or accurate thinking? And she said, I think I'll have to die in a ditch for flexibility, because if you go for flexibility, there's choice. You're not locked. You're saying it could be this interpretation or it could be this. And it's that sense of we're never more dangerous or less resilient than when we believe we're absolutely certain about something. You know?
So flexibility is open-mindedness.
Yeah, it's saying, well, you know, like, you know, somebody's late home and you're like, see, they don't care. And
right.
And it's being able to go, maybe the traffic was really bad.
Right. So it's like humility, open-mindedness, not being dogmatic.
It's reframing. It's like Karen's stuff is
actually,
CBT.
It's holding.
I want to add something here. We saw, because I've lived through the Christchurch earthquakes, where we had 2 years where our central city just collapsed and we couldn't get back into downtown for 18 months. It was literally cordoned off. So it was really interesting watching the resilience there at play amongst individuals and companies. So the most resilient individuals and companies were, as we saw in COVID again, the ones that were able to adapt to the circumstances. And so sometimes that was physically adapting. And I'm thinking now of all the accountants that we've worked with, Denise, over the last 2 years, who have actually managed to do audits virtually, which is something they never thought they would do. So yes, that's cognitive, but it's also physical. You know, it's using tech, it's being able to lean into different ways of thinking and acting. So I think
mental
we're talking
agility, you know,
mental agility, emotional agility.
Well,
cognitive.
So that's where I was going to go, right? Because when I hear flexibility cognitively, I think there's your access point to emotional agility, which could be, am I unpleasant or feeling negative and I need to move myself to positive? But am I positive in my bubble and need to move myself back to negative, right? And maybe, you know, not coincidentally, but this metaphor we keep working with, flexible, agile, sounds a lot like potential mental gymnastics. Is this a double-edged sword? Is this cognitive flexibility? Can you rationalize things? Can you be too open and not accurate enough and say, well, I kind of understand where that person's coming from, so I'll chill on the sidelines and be a bystander sort of deal? You know what I mean?
If you think about any strengths-based approaches, when you can have a strength that you underuse, or you can have a strength that you overuse, and it becomes an Achilles heel. If we overuse mental agility, it's maybe that we're always staying and moving and not sometimes sitting in where the learning is. Like I remember working with a family member some years back who found it really difficult to sit in the gunk of the mistake and the stuff up. And I'm like, I don't want you to wallow and I don't want you to stay there forever. But I think it's really helpful to stay there long enough to get the learning
process. Yeah.
You know, like if you're not willing to sit in the discomfort until you've worked out where you stuffed up, why people were upset and what you could do differently next time, then you keep repeating the mistake.
Yeah, so, to read the data.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I would say any of the capacities that we're talking about can be underused or overused. And that's that lovely thing about finding our sweet spot. Is what I'm doing helping or harming?
Yeah. And I like Karen Reivich's metaphor here for resilience, that it is a stew. And so it is a whole amalgam of ingredients, of ways of thinking and acting and being that we all make up differently. So, you know, my stew is different to Denise's, John's and Nick's. You know, some of these ingredients you might have in ample supply, some of them you might be running a bit low on, and that's okay, as long as you have got some of them and you know which yours are and you're ready to build them and notice if they are being depleted. Yeah.
Great.
You know, when I worked with Karen, I think part of the reason I was one of their senior trainers was I was the queen of me always everything thinking. I'm I'm a recovering pessimist, and I'm low on optimism and I'm low on hope,
Will
And
you,
so,
I know exactly what you mean, but just for our listeners, will you explain me, always, everything, thinking?
okay, so how we explain what has happened to ourselves is called our explanatory style. And how we do that you can describe it in 3 dimensions. Do I explain bad events to myself as permanent or temporary, personal or outside of me, or specific or pervasive? And when we work with kids, we turn that into, well, Karen turned it into, me, always, everything. So something goes, I don't get invited to a party. Was that because of me or not me? Was it because of, do I never get invited, or was it just this time? Is that because nobody loves me, or this one person in my class I didn't click with? And all of that adds up to having an optimistic or a pessimistic explanatory style.
By the way, that particular sequence, my understanding of Karen's research is can correlate highly with depression as well, because you think your problems are your fault and they're going to impact everything and they're never going to go away.
And the 2 biggest drivers that predict depression are the permanence and the personal.
Yes.
The pervasive one, isn't the bigger driver. It's those 2 in particular that predict hopelessness and depression.
Which is where where that flexibility comes in, is right? Because that you're not doing yourself any good. Not that people have a choice necessarily, right? But if you find yourself stuck in that, you've got to be able to kind of have some flexible thinking to get yourself into another channel, maybe back to that growth trajectory that we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah. And so coming back to the stew of resilience competencies, I wasn't someone who was originally blessed with optimism or hope. And so I have had to really work at developing my flexibility, my checking. Is it that? What else could it be? I'm pulling myself over.
Yeah.
And we don't all have to go through the same door. I'm not high on hope, but I get there through gratitude. I notice, so what is good? What is working for me? What have I got to be grateful for in my life? And that seems to open the door for me to become hopeful. So I think this thing of resilience is really interesting. And as Lucy says, everybody's stew is different. And it doesn't matter if you don't do it the same way as everybody else, as long as you can get there in the end.
Thank you so much, Lucy and Denise, for sharing your wonderful wisdom with us. This has been a fantastic conversation. So we have a question we like to ask all of our guests. For our final question, we call it the flourishing question. What's the one lesson on flourishing you want our listeners to walk away with? And what is a practical step for putting that into action?
Easy one, right?
Okay. Actually, so mine is that we need to be more empathetic and understanding that flourishing isn't necessarily the only goal, or the only end goal, because for so many people, particularly right now, who are dealing with bereavement, it's pretty unfair to, say to them, oh, you need to be flourishing. So I think we do need more research into what it means to be flourishing when you are dealing with a high level of adversity, because it's not impossible, but what does that look like? So, and there is some new research coming out of the Templeton Foundation there at Boston Uni as well, though they're looking at that. And so I think that's really exciting. And then I guess when you are dealing with high levels of adversity, and you're trying to keep your life on track, my piece of advice comes from Chris Futer's work, where he says, what are you hoping for now, is his question. And basically it's meaning, now that you feel like all hope is lost, what are you hoping for now? Gets us to think about, are little, that hope isn't just a one singular thing, that it has all these smaller entities underneath it. And for me, in my kind of darkest hour, having that question just shifted my goalpost from the life I thought I was living to actually what is important to me now, and really identified that, my family are everything, actually. And so once I knew and I'd identified that, it made future flourishing and future functioning a much easier, more direct roadmap for me.
That's great.
Great. Thank you.
Denise?
I think where I come back to is the seeds of the solution to any problem lie in what's working and what's good with us, and not in what's broken or what's wrong with us. And so it's not always easy, but it is absolutely vital to pay attention to what's good and what's working. Even when we've had a bit of a disaster, to look at it and go, well, okay, well, yeah, but which bits worked? What is going well? And on a really rotten day, what's still good? And I think if we can hold on to that and train our attention, pull our attention away from our massive negativity bias to what's with us, and whether that's for an individual or as a parent or as a teacher, as a leader, to be able to focus on what's right with people, what's right with our situation, can really shift the balance of our moments and therefore of our days.
I have a colleague, we'll wrap with us, and give you a chance to just tell our listeners where they can interact with you more. I have a colleague at a school you're all, I think, familiar with. We'll leave the title out, but this person is a MAP grad. So for our listeners, that's a master's in applied positive psychology. They wrote kind of their final paper on their experience navigating through cancer and surviving it and everything that came with that. I think including, double mastectomy, like the whole 9 yards. And she proposes a new concept, or what she feels is a new concept, called serene gratitude. And my head kept going there, and what you've both kind of been describing today. Grateful, but not without some unpleasantness alongside it as well, I think, right? Yeah, great. Yeah, so much good stuff today. We really appreciate you both taking some time to chat with us. We could do this sort of all day. You both have a wealth of knowledge in a variety of areas. Where can our listeners interact with you? Courses, podcasts, website, lay it on them, but we'll put it in the show notes as well.
I think the best place to contact or just see our work is on LinkedIn and on Instagram, something for everyone. Instagram is the more trivial side of our lives, and LinkedIn is where we share much of our work. So that's at the New Zealand Institute of Wellbeing and Resilience, but also on our personal LinkedIn profiles. Great.
Perfect. Yeah.
And then I know you've got a lot of educators in your listenership. So given the time educators were having over the last couple of years, we kept getting requests for people they need support. So we set up a free Facebook community called Teacher Boost. And we share, it's a place to take a break, get some support, make some connections, and get some hope. And that's the goal of Teacher Boost. And then coming from that, we have a series of kind of online learning sessions and conversations called Learning Boost. And if they come to Teacher Boost, they'll find out about those. And that's very much to try and support educators.
Beautiful.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to check these out and share them.
And then we do have a podcast called Bringing Wellbeing to Life.
There we go. Great.
And it's been going for quite a while. And like we've got a series on resilient grieving. We had another series on whole-school wellbeing that kind of accompanied our book, The Educator's Guide to Building Whole-School Wellbeing.
Great.
And for people in education. And we always say to people, it's a process. When we talk about building wellbeing in systems, the process is the content. How you involve people and bring them in is actually much more important than the nuggets of information. And so we describe a lot of our work in that book as giving people a standardized process that helps them develop individualized, contextualized wellbeing plans that are right for their school.
Great.
So if people are interested in that, that's available.
So many good resources. Like I said, we'll put everything in the show notes, but it's awesome. You're both doing tremendous work. Huge amount of respect for you both. And again, we thank you for the time, Dr. Lucy Hone and Dr. Denise Quinlan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Delight to be with you. Thank you, Nick and Joan.
Thanks, guys.
Really enjoyed this. It's been a great combo.
Huge thanks to all of you for listening to today's show.
If you like what you heard, please share it with friends, family, colleagues, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review. You can also find us on all social media platforms. We've got our own YouTube channel, and you can check out our website at flourishfmpodcast.com.
We'd also love to hear from you. There's a survey in the show notes you can complete where you can complete any suggestions on guests you'd like to hear us interview or particular topics or themes you'd like to hear us talk about. We'd love to hear feedback on that, so your feedback would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out that form. Until next time, thank you very much for joining us today.
And keep putting in the work.